So I've had a little think about it, and I think I do have some things finally that I could add about uh, characterizing Stoicism and its sort of its problematic thing, and it really does have to do with what uh, the problem in the so-called liberal mindset, although it's hardly liberal. And it does really have to do with this strange overextended sort of reliance on a concept of a kind of universal rationality. Okay, so let me just start dissecting this. And so, um, I, when I was thinking about this, I kind of got to it from the other way around. So I was actually thinking that the real problem is with this obsession with imbalance. You know, in the idea that like imbalances are fundamentally regarded in this regimented thinking as the sort of as the stuff of issues, the stuff of problems. That there's this incorrect equivalency between imbalance and a moral problem. And what that really has to do with the concept that justice is an equilibrium, is a kind of rational equilibrium. And I don't believe that yeah, and the where this sort of gets its you know the only way that it can sort of keep this formula running is if it's the kind of notion that there's one cart, one leash, one stoical dog is the kind of um, illustration and analogy of the entire setup, that in that rigid regiment, in that structure, that is a kind of that universal formula is therefore a kind of piece of the transcendental, kind of order of everything. And so that everything is uniformly to do with this, merely being able to identify imbalances. Because there's no point at which it actually sort of has a secondary sense of consideration where one is choosing to, where one actually has a free choice as to how to divide up the dichotomy of control, that there's no proactive deliberation that actually gets to, in the longer term, or at least in some arc, or in some metaphysical breakdown, actually gets to uh, be the sole arbiter that decides, so because there's no exercise of freedom on that level, there's no liberty of choosing what is under one's control and what is not under one's control. Because that dichotomy is foremost a reactive, rational exercise of some objective domain, and it never becomes under the subjective purview, or the subjective component of it is only prone to having defects or errors in terms of not corresponding to the objective um, undergirded, sort of universal, so you can kind of be, and so there is this entrenched simplicity, therefore, in which, um, correlation to this universal formula, because it has no sense of doubting itself, or it has no real it has no sophisticated sensitivity within itself, because it doesn't ever regard itself as being a vessel of freedom, merely a vessel of justice, as a functionary in this kind of reactionary reactive functionary in a kind of in a grander procession, and sort of facilitating some segment within the grander, sort of so I was going to get back to saying how it actually does kind of end up breaking its own idea that it doesn't have a mythos around itself, that it does end up sort of defaulting in as much as that one cart, one leash, one stoical dog, that you cannot actually, through the leash's correspondence to the cart, that you can over time end up becoming your own kind of stoical dog, that you can sort of go through, having gone through a transformative journey, that one gets to completely sort of, by changing the weighting of the cart through one's residual forms of corresponding to the cart, in terms of the pattern of interaction between the resistance offered to the cart via the leash, that is there is a bit of play afforded, that one can almost get to the point at which a whole unit of liberty could have been exercised, or could have been engineered to be manifest at some point. That the small features would eventually accumulate into a crossroads in which the leash could be completely untethered and reapplied to a different cart with a different weighting, that to sort of or at least the cart itself could have been treated via the leash in such a way so as to disintegrate into two disparate carts that would go off in two different directions. So there's this field of possibility and liberty within the basic constraint of Stoicism, which it has to kind of fundamentally disguise from itself, or shy away from, or avoid. And in the avoidance of that level of meta-adversity, it is in fact relying on something of a kind of mythos, but it's a kind of, you could call it it's something like the passive and dead logos, upon which there is a kind of a universal transcendental quality, in which you only ever have access to a piece of its puzzle, and therefore must just be passively relegated to whatever reactive functionary role that one is playing, according to this kind of cosmic mythos that is beyond one's comprehension. So then one sort of implicitly or inherently has access to, in terms of one's emotional sense of integrity, or being this vessel of this greater justice, which one will never be able to sort of figure out in one's own part of it. And so it really, I think it even connotates to the sort of the notion of being a part of the world in some sort of pseudo-spiritual sense, which I do also find fundamentally problematic, because it's sort of at least in this context, in terms of the kind of weird hypocrisy that is entailed in that kind of anyway. And yeah, so let me just go back to harping on about the imbalances. And so this, I think, is the biggest problem. Therefore, and you can see how this conforms very nicely to at least some interpretations of virtue ethics, where the issue is merely an imbalance. The moral problem is a kind of imbalance, and then that's kind of transposed as a rational imbalance. Or some kind of reading or evaluation of disequilibrium, which then implies a rational deficit or a rational imbalance. This is, while sort of completely negating the meta-stoicism or the meta issue that freedom allows, that that there is always like there's a potential of coordination, which is the calculus of which is just completely set aside in order to preserve this idea that there is this main drive, there are these main forces. The cart is on these very definitive tracks, which cannot be redirected or diverted. That in some sense the resistance to the cart is merely is a dissonance that cannot amount to any other possibility. It's merely a form of rational disobedience. And this connotates positivistic moral sentiment, which has always been hideous and sort of ended up relying on formal moral codes. And the Roman legal system, for instance, is a marvel, but I don't, and it does have a feature of something that is similar perhaps to some element of positivism, but it's not a positivistic. I mean, it only functions because the rules and regulations that embody it do amount to a safeguarded moral domain that does have an independent life, that does have an independent it's honest about its positivistic tyranny to the extent to which it flexes those muscles, and therefore one as a participant can know how to avoid being crushed or ill-served by those elements within itself. It's not philosophically presumed, those things. They are written into the structure, and which I almost think is significant of a sensitivity to the ill and the moral sort of poison that positivism posits. Okay, let me just think if I can say something more relevant, but going back to imbalances. And so, yeah, I do think that there's a fundamental problem when justice is incorrectly equivalated into an equilibrium of some sort. there is obviously a rational consistency which things should have to live up to. And Stoicism does have a method which does involve at least some level of a kind of self-imposed self-coherency or self-consistency, but it doesn't, in a more robust sense, it's not comprehensive enough. And it's sticking to its guns and believing that it is a kind of complete system, I'm afraid, will merely be a reflection of its own table thumping its own rational prestige, in some sense. And a kind of authority on the basis of rationality, which is actually, I believe, in a detailed analysis, is unwarranted. But it's interesting how that is also the character of the so-called liberal political sort of movement. That, and I've also criticized that movement from other perspectives, that it doesn't really have a cohesive worldview. It doesn't really, it's based on critique. It's based on a negative value system. It doesn't have a positive vision. These are things that I've always said about it. That it doesn't, in an independent sense, have an idea of what it wants to get to. It merely rejects those things that it finds unsuitable. So, it has this very sort of, or deconstructivist, sort of process, and that is interesting, because I do think that in some sense, at least that's how I've come to sort of understand the process of Stoicism, is that within a particular bounded context that it already sort of sees itself as being a part of, it does operate quite the same way, and it does maximize what it does maximize within itself. The problem is that if it doesn't have a greater command of the overarching metaphysical sort of its metaphysical features, and it's capable of actually creating a real argument or engagement with other competing moral schemas, then it ends up having to rest on its own sort of relativistic, subjective, kind of individual access to this piece of the rational collective soul, in some sense. And it ends up really having to rely on quite a brittle mythos in order to kind of sustain its own views and to sort of order them and make sense of them. And I do think that the highest defect of this is this kind of table-thumped notion that there is only one cart that is tethered with one leash, and the stoical dog that one has will be fed in conjunction with will gain all of its properties by the journey that it is ironclad with. And I mean, I could be stricter with myself when I try to take this illustration apart. But I mean, there are many ways in which there are correspondence between the cart and the dog. There are techniques, that there are multiple ways in which the narrative of that rational setup, can be challenged or subverted. Although, as mere analogous illustration, they don't really seem that significant. But they're best illustrated by the idea that at some point the cart can be substituted for, and effectively the leash can be substituted for. The one can construct over a pattern of correspondence. Anyway, that loses its sort of its explanatory powers, but and all of those factors essentially have to be neatly disregarded in order to maintain this idea that the best one can do is merely an equilibrium, is merely a sense of maintaining and tending to matters of a maximized equilibrium. And I can agree in the notion that equilibrium of something that must actually be more dynamic, that it actually incorporates a sense of positive, proactive liberty and choice, of which there are resources for such levers to be introduced into the narrative, which is not merely devoid of being a narrative merely because there is this invocation that no, Stoicism is fundamentally a non-narrative because it is not reactionary, because this is the full capacity, there is no more. So it's self-imposed atheism or agnosticism upon its own narrative, I think, does lead itself to be validly criticized, that it does in fact default and revert into something of a default narrative, which can be characterized, it can be depicted. And it's funny because all of these arguments, they run completely parallel to what has been argued against in terms of the so-called liberal postmodern sort of ethos and framing of society and morality and such. And I do think that there is something of a translation between these things. It's not entirely clear, but I do think that they do offer their adherents this level of this is their moral program. This is it. It's a I don't believe that this is necessarily the I don't know if I'm perhaps talking out of my depth, but I do think that there is actually a history of Stoicism having this weird kind of idea that what I consider to be the Kantian sort of toxicity, which is that the Kantian categorical imperative is all very fine, and it's all very fine so long as you say that only individuals should employ the Kantian sort of way of thinking. As soon as you try to imbue an institution or an organization or some kind of collective body that is meant to embody and uphold those moral precepts, you get something incredibly poisonous. When you try to have an institution that sort of makes those guarantees about its collective, you get a really sort of toxic inception in which it actually invalidates its own moral basis. It literally deprives people on the individual level. It puts them into a strange sort of political, it puts them in in a compromised political, sort of actorship, where they have to sort of act to maximize this thing in the collective, and therefore they're not acting to maximize it in their own interpersonal relations. And so they've got this sort of this megaphone via which the moral domain is given the secondary a secondary domain, which has to find some strange way to sort of relate itself to the initial domain, which is the domain of the individual. And these things are sort of just assumed to be fundamentally sort of transposed and intertwined in a kind of in such strange ways, so as to endorse strange slogans that never work out, like separate but equal, which is almost exactly what the whole the so-called liberal ethos is at the moment, in order to sort of endorse identity politics, which has these themes of the collective and such. So you have to, in order to maximize the separate but equalness, which supposedly is for the benefit of the individual, and therefore imbalances need to be rationally ironed out, even though all of those actions, I would say, have absolutely no bearing or correlation. Well, that's interesting. Okay, that is probably technically correct, that they do have a correlation to moral issues, but they have no causative interface with moral issues. And it's in that strange fudged space, that muddied water, where a correlation is taken to kind of aggregate into some sort of stereotype of causation. And that is the kind of the gainsaying that, that there's this rational sort of drive in history, that there's this rational overarching objective dichotomy of what is controlled and what is beyond control, and so that dichotomy is used, I would say, in a specious way to endorse programs which somehow inherit a moral authority, which is wholly unjustified, and they are quite counter to morality. So I've kind of gone on this little journey, which is perhaps a little bit tough to follow, but I just want to reiterate some of those points then, that the rationality, what is it, so the specious claim that imbalances are correlated with injustices, that ends up aggregating itself into this sort of it reverts to sort of relying on a reduction that notion is as good as like a moral truth. when, right at the start, at its particle, one can just consider it in a rational way and debunk it very quickly. So just the mere notion that imbalances are themselves the manifestation of injustices. Why? One can it really is appealing to a kind of sentiment of sort of built-in stereotypes. I mean, I can think of and it is built, I think, on a sense of and I do think that this is a historical weakness of the Stoics, that although they were tough on themselves in terms of some kind of mechanical, hypothetical consideration, they were very lax upon themselves in sort of working out a bank of convenient correlations between a somewhat a caricatured worldview in which certain conditions seem to just sort of inherently imply a kind of a state of rationality, or the state of the logos. That inequality was by its very was by its very sort of appearance um, to me, I make this grand distinction that there's a vast difference between a verb and an adjective. That as soon as you create a bank of adjectives that are morally charged, rather than a bank of verbs that are morally charged, and it is correct to charge a verb with a moral connotation, but to have that built into an adjective, there is a level of laxity there. There is a level of it's just much too convenient. It's unjustifiable as well, but it will lead to the most horrendous kinds of demagoguery, really. You are creating the cultural instruments for a society of a kind of a very self-righteous groupthink, but one that is not capable of actually doing the individual discerning that is required to maintain a rational culture that is actually capable of sort of doing anything other than maximize its own sense of reactive vigor, so, which I do in some sense see that as the kind of, that is maybe the only thing that that is the only cultural achievement, if one can even call it that, because it is such an unsustainable aspect of a fascistic society, is that it's able to say, well, our people are, sort of, they have fire in their bellies, and they sort of, and we have to give them books to burn every now and again, and we have to reinvent the conspiracy that we have collectively sort of been uncovering and sort of and exist in spite thereof, and it's sort of, I mean, that on some level, I think that's a bit unfair to lay at the feet of Stoics, but I do think that there is a way in which, there is at least within a fascistic society, there is something of a two-tier system. There are the occult leaders, the nefarious controllers, who are beyond the pleb morality, that are tending to and sort of creating the continuing conditions that keep the pleb morality sort of fed in some sense. And well, in this setup, so the Stoics would be plying the kind of, or I mean, I guess even famously, it was a good it was even described as a good political piece of public life. It facilitated a level of political acuity, or at least strength of a collective state. Anyway, I just wanted to show how it was perhaps capable of subversion, and how it's sort of, how it doesn't necessarily have within itself the if a Stoic in these conditions, as part of a culture or society, understood that at the highest level the whole thing was an orchestrated farce, would they have the bones to take up arms against their own system of culture that they sort of inherited or were born from? And would the internal virtue ethics trade-off, which sort of impels them to be just a kind of a functionary of offering collateral support, just to make a rather sort of dry metaphysical point, that these principles, as they are constructed, are built on a faulty thinking, that trying to, the idea that there are separate but equal identities is something that pretends to be a moral principle, but it really just generates a set of moral codes that is based on making justice into an adjective, and so it's like, it's not, the question is not, how can we know what racism is or prejudice is a priori? It's, always asking the negative question: how is this not racist? How do we get to a point that this is not racist, and therefore there will be no imbalance within our adjective-driven ethical code, which, I actually, I mean, to be semantically, technically correct, I would say that it actually replaces the realm of ethics with just moral codes, and you get something of a, then you kind of have an automatic stoicism which is imposed on people, because they're sort of, when argument and the principle driving people's actions is not incorporated into the adjudication of the legal process, when it's just merely correlating one's actions to outcomes. Anyway, these are rather extreme circumstances, but I do think that they're somewhat relevant to the subject matter. I'm going to stop the recording. Sadly, I do think I probably could have emphasized better on some of those salient aspects to make them also more relevant to the current sort of cultural climate and such, and the themes within modern politics and such.